I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have to run.
Hello everyone, welcome to the AmErica show. I am your host, Erica. Happy New Year, happy January 2026. Now, January marks the end of Kwanzaa, remembers Emancipation Proclamation, and celebrates the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So let's welcome January. Now let's talk about today's topic of discussion, which is civil rights movement, which was a sweeping struggle primarily during the 1950s and 1960s to end racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans and secure equal rights under US law. It reshaped the nation's legal, political, and cultural landscape. I visited the National Museum of African American History and Culture and was deeply moved by the tremendous contributions that African Americans have made across countless fields over decades and centuries. The United States will mark 250 years of independence from 1776 to 2026, standing as a global superpower and the world's largest democracy. Slavery in the United States was formally abolished in 1865 with the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the US Constitution. Yet it is deeply shocking and concerning that even today, innocent African Americans continue to lose their lives with the haunting words, "I can't breathe." Echoing our collective conscience. No democratic nation should discriminate against its citizens based on the color of their skin. We must practice what we preach by honoring the principle of one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I am gonna stand up, take my people with me. Together we are going to a brand new home. Far across the river, can you hear freedom calling? Calling me to answer, gonna keep on keeping on. I can feel it in my bones. I can feel it. I can feel it in my bones. I can feel it, feel it, feel it, feel it in my bones. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you. I go to prepare a place for you. Mayo Bartlett is the principal attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC. He worked for the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for more than 10 years, serving as a litigator in the Superior Court Trial Division and Chief of the Bias Crimes Unit. He is a co-founder of Safe Passage, a youth law forum that brings issues of law and policy to the classroom. He was a member of the advisory board of the Westchester Holocaust Education Center, assisting the center in the development of a juvenile hate crime offender program. Mayo has served as an adjunct professor of law at Pace Law School and he was an active member of the New York State Hate Crimes Coalition in support of passage of the Hate Crime Act of 2000, the first comprehensive hate crime legislation in New York State. He is a former vice president and director of the Westchester County Bar Association, where he served as a co-chair of the Criminal Justice Section, as a member of the Judiciary Committee, and as a delegate to the New York State Bar Association. Mayo is a former director of the Westchester County Black Bar Association and former chair of the Westchester County Human Rights Commission. Mayo is a convener of We Are Westchester, which is a coalition of not-for-profit organizations focusing on social justice. He is also a founding member of New Bridges, which is a coalition of not-for-profits focused on alleviating hate and bringing different cultures together, and which originated when the Urban League of Westchester County, the African American Men of Westchester, OCA, the India Center, and the NAACP joined together to address anti-Asian hate. So Mayo, I request you to talk a little bit about yourself, your journey, and whatever you want to tell to our audience.
Thank you very much for having me, Erica. I really appreciate it. So I'm Mayo Bartlett. I'm an attorney. I grew up in Greenburgh, New York. I am a descendant of people who were born just outside of slavery. As Erica said, slavery ended in the United States in 1865. My grandfather on my father's side was born in 1903, and his parents lived through slavery. And my grandparents on my mother's side lived in Keystone, West Virginia, in McDowell County, which is one of the 3 poorest counties in the United States each and every year, coal mining town. And my parents and my grandparents lived through segregation in the United States. So when my parents were teenagers, they couldn't have a sandwich at Woolworth's. They were not able to go to many places in the South where white people could go. In fact, when they went to college, there were bathrooms for whites and for coloreds. And that's not ancient history. So I want to just really ask us to look at what our actual history has been, and then to look at what we're capable of being. And unfortunately, many of us never really learned the history of the United States. We're told some platitudes that it's always been about freedom, that it's the greatest place on earth, without having any idea of what else exists on earth, and that we are exceptional, which in and of itself suggests that others are not. And when you stop and you look at who founded the United States, it was founded on basically the backs of indigenous people who were more or less exterminated. There was a genocide that happened here in the United States. There's a book called The American Holocaust. There's another one called A Little Matter of Genocide, which gets into that and talks about just the millions of people who were here, that there was a thriving society in the United States, and that those people were essentially eliminated, sometimes intentionally, other times not necessarily intentionally, but by introduction of viruses and other things. And then after that, there was enslavement of people in the United States for 400 years. And that culminated just about 100 years before I was born, which is not a long time. When slavery ended, then we went straight into segregation, and segregation essentially ended right around the time of my birth. So although I always joke and say that I'm quite often one of the older people in the room, I'm not that old. So when you stop and you look at the fact that we are taught that all men are created equal, well, in one sense, it was considered that the Constitution was for men, because it was for men, but it wasn't for all men, it was for white men. And it was for white men primarily who were landowners, and that did not envision somebody who was the owner of a condominium. There were no condominiums, or owned a quarter-acre lot someplace. It was people who essentially owned Greenburgh. And even for those people, they were not trusted to make a good decision. And you had the Electoral College, which could override their actual determination, and which was to preserve a balance between the North and the South, and the poorer, smaller states and the larger states, but not individuals. So by definition, if somebody is in a state that has a much larger population, their representation is actually smaller per capita because the Electoral College evens it out. So if you're in a very small state, you have more representation, your individual vote will mean more. It wasn't until centuries that black men were able to vote. And in fact, black men were able to vote before white women were able to vote. Many of us are not aware of that. And I like to go to the Star Spangled Banner. Many of us like to recite that. You go to sporting events, you sing the Star Spangled Banner. We believe it's patriotic, but most of us don't know what the Star Spangled Banner actually says, or that Francis Scott Key was a Confederate, and that Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner in part against black people, slaves who were seeking freedom. And the second verse says, "On the shore so dimly lit, seen through the mist of the deep, where the foe's haughty host in dread silence reposes, what is that which the breeze over the towering steep, as it fitfully blows, half conceals, half discloses? Now it catches the gleam of the morning's first beam. In the full glory, reflected now shines in the stream. 'Tis the Star-Spangled Banner, oh, long may it wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." Verse 3 is a verse I ask you all to go and read and learn about, and it goes, "And where is that band who so vauntingly swore that the havoc of war and the battle's confusion, a home and a country should leave us no more? Their blood has washed out of their foul footsteps pollution. No refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave. And the Star-Spangled Banner in triumph doth wave over the land of the free and the home of the brave." Now, somehow I don't think we're going to sing that at the World Series or at the Super Bowl, okay? But that very much was the sentiment of the United States. I always find it amazing that that is our national anthem when we have so many other songs that are much more beautiful, such as "America the Beautiful," which embraces everybody, which celebrates the greatness of the United States and doesn't ignore the history, which is not a history that we should be proud of, but it looks at what the great potential is, which is as great as any country's potential is.
Excellent. Very informative. Okay, I have some questions for Mayo. Dr. King said, "I have a dream." So what is your dream and how can you make it come true?
My dream is a day when we no longer look at each other and divide each other based upon who you are, what you look like, who we think you are, who you love, what your religion may be if you have a religion, what country you may be from, what part of the United States you may be from. When you look at your neighbor and you see that person simply as your neighbor, and you realize that you could be closer to someone in Connecticut than you might be to someone in Buffalo, to not see that person as your rival because they're one house away, but it's in Greenwich instead of Port Chester. My dream is to get to a point where we actually have real education for everyone. I'd love to see real health care for everyone. I'd like to no longer demonize those who are newcomers to the United States. I'd love for us to teach the real history, which embraces the fact that first-generation Irish people were not embraced when they came to the United States, that there were signs in windows that said "No dogs, no Irish," that Italians were not embraced when they first came to the United States, that it was without papers, WAP was without papers. Those were the people who were demonized at the time, as opposed to the people now who often are black and brown from the Caribbean or from Asia or from Africa. But it's the same theme, it's just different people. I'd love for us to get to the point where we play freedom forward instead of passing the pain on to others.
Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865 at Point Blank Range while watching a play at the Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, who was himself an actor. So what is your take on the Emancipation Proclamation and on Mr. Lincoln's assassination?
Well, I think that I can't look into the mind of Mr. Booth, so I don't know why he assassinated Mr. Lincoln, but Mr. Lincoln was doing things that disrupted many people's lives. It's important also for us to understand that the Emancipation Proclamation actually paid reparations to slaveholders. Okay, it didn't really pay reparations to those who were enslaved. So if you were a slave owner, you got paid money because you lost an asset. That's not taught either in school. I don't recall learning that in school. So I'd like to actually learn history as opposed to a mythology of who we are. The myth was that we, as freed slave people, received 40 acres and a mule, and some people did, but quite often that was taken from them by force, and they ended up with nothing. And you can also look at thriving communities such as Rosewood or Greenwood, and you have communities that were thriving that were burned down in rage by the Klan or by sometimes by white neighbors who weren't doing quite as well. So I think that the dream for me, again, is that we have honesty, that we have truth and reconciliation, and that we find a path to move forward for all of us in the United States, moving together as opposed to demonizing one another. But the Emancipation Proclamation also was something that came out of necessity. So as happy as I am that President Lincoln signed it, President Lincoln also saw a world where he didn't think that freed slaves should live with white people. So I think that it's important to understand that President Lincoln was a complex person, and that he also, in fairness, was a person of his time. So I don't anticipate that he would have been Bernie Sanders in the 1800s. However, he also was a flawed person, as we all are.
I recall, one thing that I learned from school, that white color has all other colors of the vivjeur and different shades of the vivjeur. So it has to be that way, that will create a complete harmony. How has Black Lives Matter movement influenced legal reform efforts in policing and criminal justice?
I'd say that the Black Lives Movement basically allowed people to see some of the injustices that occur in the United States because it received coverage, it received media attention, and lots of people who were not aware of some of the issues that occur with respect to policing became aware. I will also say that those issues in terms of policing are not necessarily limited to people who are of African descent. And you see it all the time. In fact, there was the recent shooting of the ICE protester in Minnesota. She was not a black person, was not African American.
Yeah, Renee Nicole Good.
Yes, Ms. Good was not. So, in fact, many people who are victims of police use of force are not African American. For some reason, the media tends to focus on particular cases. And in my estimation, they do so in a way which is sometimes designed to pit people against each other, to give the narrative that if you are black, you're against the police, and if you're white, you're in favor of the police, you're a patriot, and if you're questioning police use of force, then you are a protester or you are an activist. And in my mind, anybody who's in support of the Constitution is the actual patriot. That should not be anybody who's in favor of anyone being harmed, but it should be looking at the training, looking at use of force. One of the things that Black Lives Matter was able to do was to have communities in New York State, based upon a decree from Governor Cuomo, to look at the police departments in your community. Every community was required to do that in order to get funding. We did that here in Westchester County, and one of the things we learned in Westchester was that only I believe 50% of the police departments in Westchester County are accredited, which means that as an attorney, I can't practice law if I'm not accredited. I have a license to practice law. Without that, I can't go to court for somebody. And in New York State, only 25%. So that's 1 out of 4 police departments are accredited. That's important for each and every one of us. Doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. And that means that in my mind, you should have an expectation that your police department is a licensed professional police department. And it's not to suggest that there may not be out there police departments that are not accredited that could be actually the gold standard of policing. It's simply that we don't know. So if you don't have that bare standard minimum, and accreditation is a bare minimum. It doesn't mean that you're the greatest. It's the bare minimum. When you go to see a doctor and that's a licensed physician, that means that person has met the bare minimum requirements to be a doctor. Doesn't mean that they are the expert or that they are the person you necessarily want to go to. So I think that every police department should be accredited. Some police departments might even be at a point where they need assistance from a neighboring police department. Then perhaps it's time to reimagine whether we need so many departments or whether they can come together. It's important to look at whether the police are working with other agencies, whether they have support from mental health professionals, whether the officers themselves are in a position where their mental health is sufficient for them to actually serve as the role of law enforcement. And there are a host of things that we should be looking at as a community to make sure that we have best practices in policing.
Excellent answers. I'm so happy that I have you today in the panel. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. How do you see Nelson Mandela's legacy of nonviolence when the gun violence is unstoppable in USA? How can attorneys contribute to long-term structural reform beyond individual cases of African Americans being killed in a gun violence? Should the Second Amendment of our Constitution be reformed? How responsible is NRA, National Rifles Association?
Well, I think that the word responsible is the key. And in the United States, we have lots of freedoms. What we don't stress, again, and it goes back to education, what we teach and what we don't teach. There's a lack of responsibility. So you can't have freedom without responsibility. Some people believe that they have the right to get on the highway and drive as fast as they want to. Well, you don't. Your freedom ends where it impacts other people in a negative way, where it actually hurts somebody else or takes away their freedom. So as somebody who's a licensed driver, it's incumbent upon me to be responsible, to drive carefully, to drive prudently, to make sure that I am as responsible as I can be behind the wheel. When you look at gun violence, when you look at the Second Amendment, I don't have any issues with the Second Amendment. I do think, however, that there needs to be responsibility. I think that if I am going to have a gun, I need to be properly trained. I need to be able to have an assessment to ensure that I'm a person who's mentally stable enough to have a weapon, that I safeguard my weapon properly, that it's not a threat to my own family because a child might find a gun not secured, that I don't have substance abuse issues, things like that. But in my mind also that the gun violence is a concerted effort. And unfortunately, our cities are flooded with weapons. And I tend to wonder whether that is by design. But I will also tell you that I have represented and prosecuted many, many people who've simply possessed a gun that they didn't have a license for. And some laws are in place and some policies are in place to prevent people who've not committed any crimes from being able to get a lawful license to possess a firearm. And in fact, the vast majority of people who have guns never use those guns, never threaten people with the guns, don't shoot anybody, and don't harm anybody with the weapon. So I think that sometimes it's an opportunity, let's say in the black community, to know that you will deny a young person the right to get a licensed gun, and that you can arrest that person and have them go to prison for 15 years simply for the possession of a gun, even though that gun, other than lack of having a license, would not have otherwise been used in an illegal way.
Great. Okay, so I want to ask you one more question before our closing. What is your take on defund the police and systemic racism? What is your take on the Sixth Amendment of the US Constitution, which explicitly guarantees the right to an attorney for anyone accused in a criminal prosecution?
With respect to defund the police, I always thought that there could have been better language. And I think that quite often, some people mean literally defund the police, and that's fine. That everybody has a right to their opinion. A lot of people, though, were talking about funding other things. They were looking at the amount of money that went to the police department, and they were looking at the things that are not funded. So, for instance, mental health services generally are underfunded. Some communities may not have it funded at all. So I like to look at whether we need particular funding anywhere in government. So if there's an area in government where we can see that there's waste, then we should cut that waste or reallocate that money, reallocate those resources, reallocate the personnel. Because quite often we have very capable personnel. They may be serving in a function that we may no longer need, but it doesn't mean we can't use those people in a different capacity. So it doesn't necessarily mean terminating the job or totally cutting the funding. However, also in government, we tend to always want more. So we tend to say that you have to always ask for more each year. I don't know that that's necessary. So in my mind, I look at defund the police differently. I tend to think that the police should be working hand in hand with people who are mental health professionals, that they may not be the first responder for a mental health crisis, but they should probably be available and be in close proximity or be the second person there just in case there's a need to have law enforcement intervene. But quite often, the police are not trained also in how to deal with somebody who has a mental health issue. And they may end up escalating a situation instead of de-escalating that same situation. So I think that it's really important to look at how we use the resources, how we train people, how we prepare police to be able to be at their best when they are working with the community.
Thank you so much. Okay, so your closing statement on this particular question: what role should community organizations play in shaping up legal strategies for justice? Is our society repeating and respecting the 13th Amendment of ending slavery in the true sense? Who is responsible by not practicing what is preached?
Well, the 13th Amendment is funny. Again, going back to education, I'd like to focus on that part of it. We are taught, again, that slavery ended in 1865. Well, it really did not. The 13th Amendment says that there will be no slavery unless you are incarcerated. Well, we are in a country where there are prisons for profit, so we have private prisons. In fact, I have serious issues with a lot of the public-private partnerships because, in my estimation, it tends to be public resources taken out, given to private entities, which quite often don't do the work that the public resource was intended to do. But also, when you're imprisoned, you can be enslaved. So essentially, when you're in prison, you can work essentially for free. You maybe get pennies on the dollar or something along those lines when you're working for a large corporation, which loves to have you do that. So lots of our organic food is grown in prisons. Many of us are not aware of that. During the pandemic, a lot of the hand sanitizer was made in prison. Well, those people didn't benefit from it, and in fact, sometimes they didn't even have access to their own hand sanitizer that they were making. I think it's time that we stop demonizing each other, that we look, in fact, in many of the red states, Utah, for instance, there's expungement. So if you have a criminal conviction outside of, let's say, sex abuses and serious violent felonies, your case is expunged, and you're welcome back into the community. And I think we have to get to the point where we become mature enough as a society to realize that, yes, we all will make mistakes, and that there should be accountability for that mistake. But once you've paid your debt, you have to be welcomed back into the society. We can't have you on the outskirts and ostracize you, because that's not tenable. And it also will cost us all so much more to have to raise somebody else's family as opposed to empowering them to do that.
Thank you so much. Mel, I have no words how to thank you. I mean, I tried to cover as much as questions as possible, but there are always a lot more to talk about, to discuss about, and to tell our community and beyond. So I am going to give my closing. So it's indeed my great, great, great pleasure to have Mr. Mayo Bartlett to find some time on a Monday morning during his, in spite of his super busy and hectic schedule, to come to the studio and give us the opinion and talk about and discuss about certain issues which are real issues, factual issues. And my tremendous amount of thankfulness goes to the Town Supervisor, Mr. Paul Feiner, and also to the very talented and charismatic engineers of this studios. And I hope to see you guys soon. So I'm going to come again in February with a brand new theme, and I'm going to talk about it. And I really want to once again thank to Mayo. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure indeed.
I've been walking with my face turned to the sun. Weight on my shoulders, a bullet in my gun. Oh, I got eyes in the back of my head, just in case I have